Hello, and welcome to the Uncommon Career or Daring to Succeed podcast, wherever you're listening from. I'm Julianna, and I'm joined by Patricia Ortega, and today we are going to talk about assertiveness in communication. Patricia, do you want to walk us through kind of what we were chatting about before we hit record and why this is such an important topic?
Yeah. I was telling you about one of my clients, and actually multiple clients, but one in particular that I talked to this week, and the subject of assertiveness came up. And we talked about how sometimes it can be like a personal thing, like, oh, I feel like I'm not being assertive. But more often than not, you find yourself in situations every single day at home and at work, but especially at work when your boundaries are tested or, people either unintentionally or intentionally push those boundaries to where it hinders your well-being. Maybe there's a conversation that's being monopolized or your perspective is overlooked or assume that you don't have a perspective. There's so many things. Expectations can be unclear. And now, you're having to meet needs that you wouldn't have needed to meet if you had voiced your opinion. And so I thought, let's have a conversation around this good balance of being assertive while also, sometimes people think assertive means aggressive, but they're actually on opposite ends of the spectrum. And so I thought, let's have a conversation about what that looks like and how we can increase our assertiveness, especially if we're in leadership, without leaning towards the aggressive side of things. So we keep our relationships positive.
Yeah, that's such a great summary. And I think this one will really resonate with everyone listening out there because especially now, it's so easy to hide behind screens or ignore things. So once we get into those really sticky situations, those interpersonal situations where we need to kind of ramp up our assertiveness to either set our boundaries or protect ourselves or advocate for ourselves, so critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I know that you've worked with some clients also who have gone through similar situations like this. Is there an example in your mind that comes up that can maybe put a little bit more of, a person behind this, like a story that we could share? I know I shared mine a little bit earlier. Curious if you have one too.
Yeah, I definitely have a client that comes to mind who I don't even know that she really frames it in terms of assertiveness, but she's always looking to her boss for direction. And she herself is a manager. And I find for her particular situation, it's more that she doesn't trust that she has the answers or knows what she's doing, even though in the coaching session, she will come up with a plan. She knows exactly what she's doing. She understands her work, but there's still that little bit in her that's preventing her from showing up with that assertiveness to say, yes, I know what I'm talking about. I deserve airtime in these conversations with the other managers.
hmm
I don't know if that's similar to what you're seeing with your clients.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And when you said I deserve airtime, what it reminded me of is actually not a client, but a conversation I had with Elaine Lynn Herring. And she and I did a podcast episode a little while back. It reminded me, she has this book. It's called Unlearning Silence. Really, really good. And it talks about how we have been, in a way, taught and have accepted the message that it's easier if we don't rock the boat. And so this goes both for the environment that you're creating, but also in this conversation for how you're allowing either yourself to be silenced by choosing not to speak when speaking could be to your benefit. So it's just really interesting that you mentioned that. And I feel like I hear that all the time as well, where it's like, oh, I don't hear, well, I don't want to rock the boat. But what I do hear is I don't want to sound like I'm monopolizing the conversation. I don't want to come off like I'm taking over. I don't want to feel like I'm being aggressive, right? And so that is a signal to me to say, okay, well, there's some level of discomfort with asserting that you have an opinion and that you have boundaries and that you have expectations.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a good starting point for our listeners to kind of check in with themselves when that is the reason they're not speaking up. Because I'm thinking of another client who is trying to advocate for herself for a fairly significant promotion. And her reason for not doing it is because she was interviewing people and there was this one person who rammed into the interviews talking about how amazing they were, and it was not based on anything that could be substantiated. And my challenge to her was, okay, I understand your fear, but do you think you would actually come across that way? And are you able to substantiate the reason why would be a good fit for this role? And her answer was, oh, well, no, of course not. I would never present myself that way. And I do have all of these tangible skills that make me a good candidate for this role. So I
Mhm.
think when those worries start to creep in, that's a really good checkpoint for you to stop and ask yourself, okay, I'm worried I'm going to come across as taking over the conversation or speaking out of turn or whatever it is that how you think you will actually present yourself?
Yes, such a opportunity to reframe. What you're saying, what I hear you saying, and I so agree with it, is you have been looking at the person you don't want to be like, or you have been imagining a person you don't want to be like. But there is an assertive, confident, and I sometimes use the word humble confidence. Like there's an assertive, humbly confident person who does it right. And so it's like, let's find the person we want to emulate or use an example and then find our own style within that. So it's kind of this permission to experiment with your style a little bit, to find that place where you can be assertive while at the same time feeling really good about how you're coming off.
Oh, I love that idea of modeling yourself after what you want to be rather than running away from what you don't. Because I think anybody who has the self awareness to question whether they will come across in a negative way or in an undesirable way is already beyond. They've already moved further than the person who is coming across in that way that they're trying to avoid. I don't know if I'm saying it the right way.
Oh, I'm totally picking up what you're putting down 100%. And you know what it makes me think? There's that side of things, right? Kind of have I had an experience that I don't want to recreate, right? That someone has been a certain way towards me that I don't want to recreate. And then let's figure out what the positive side of that would be, like what's a positive experience that you can use as an example. But at the same time, there's that very practical side. But then I always wonder when this comes up, and I wonder because I've been in this situation myself too, is there sometimes, or could there be, an emotional side to things? Like underneath the layer, do you feel like you're going to come off as if this is a conflict because somewhere deep inside you feel that this is a conflict? And if that's the case, this is where coaching can be so incredibly helpful. And my friend, if you're listening, you can reach out to Julianna, you can reach out to myself, and we can process that conversation. Because in those conversations, in those coaching conversations where we process underlying emotion, you can then come to the conversation freely. And it's usually a negative anxiety or a frustration from prior experiences that make you feel like this is a conflict, even if it may not actually be a conflict for them. So being able to process that emotion, come to a neutral place, you can naturally be more assertive without feeling like it's going to come off the wrong way.
Yeah, that's such a great point because what I find is a lot of the times people will avoid those conversations and um, not really step into their own because of those emotional responses, those initial emotional responses, because it seems like the conversation is so scary. And I know for myself that's happened before where it's like, oh, I need to have this conversation. And exactly what Patricia described was in my head, I worked it up to this big, oh my God, it's going to be this massive disagreement. Our whole relationship's going to fall apart. I'm going to get fired and blah, 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 all these negative things. When if I actually had someone help me, not necessarily calm down, but look at the situation objectively, I could have seen that it wasn't as risky as I like blew it out of proportion in my own mind to be.
That is so accurate. Even the most competent professionals, even the most successful professionals, we all can have this tendency to potentially catastrophize when there's something going on in our head. And if we don't have that conversation or we don't neutralize that thought, the story becomes bigger, the villain becomes bigger. And so then I completely agree with you, completely agree with you. So altogether, it's sort of like, let's start with the kind of awareness of where we are in mentally, like where we are emotionally. And then also, what is it that is framing our conversation or framing this feeling that we have? Is it the situation we don't want to emulate? Or do we have a positive example of assertiveness? But Juliana, if we were to move into like the highly practical, like for example, verbal cues, right? What are some things that we can say? Like, for example, there's all these Instagram carousels and all this telling us, don't apologize. Don't say, I'm sorry for being late. Say, thank you for your patience, right? What are some other things that for you come up that could be examples, or what would you recommend when it comes to the language that we use?
So, my favorite trick for getting into a conversation, especially with people who dominate the conversation. So these are the people, you know them. They're talking nonstop in the conversation. They don't let anybody get into it. They don't seem to even breathe. Because usually I try to wait for somebody to pause and then jump in. But for these people who are so passionate that they can't even stop speaking, I find making eye contact, even if it's through Zoom or whatever, and then saying yes, and then saying whatever you want to say, even if you're actually disagreeing with them, somehow that word, that positive trigger, I think feeds feeds a part of their brain that needs the reinforcement, just enough for them to like take a breath so that someone else can get into the conversation. It doesn't always work, but I find some of those positive phrases, positive words, when interjected, work a lot better than well or but or something a little bit negative because someone who is maybe not as confident in themselves or whatever it is that's causing them to not allow other people into the conversation will just steamroll over those other words. But if they're hearing affirmative words, it's just enough to bring their guard down so that they'll let someone else into the conversation.
It's so real. You catch more bees with honey. Like it's just a natural human instinct that when I'm in mid conversation and if I'm like really passionate about something and I'm like, oh my gosh, and A and B and C and D, and I can attest that if I don't pay attention, I can become that person who's like, let me tell you about all the things that I'm so excited, right? And so it's very possible. And I've heard, especially early career, I've heard people say, well, you're kind of intimidated, so I can't really interrupt you. And I'm like, whoa, 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 like that was never my intention. And so I've had to really work on that. But I will tell you this, as someone who's on the other side of the table on that, I have had people, and I've noticed it in myself when someone says, oh my gosh, as soon as you say, I really agree with you, I'm like, oh, tell me more. Tell me more about how you, and that's just like the normal human conversation where you inevitably, we all want to know how our ideas are valid. And so when you say, oh, I really agree with you, and here's another way that we can move this project forward, now I'm listening because what you've done is you've established that you're on the same team. And I want to be on the same team with you too. But I wanted to point that out because I'm like, oh, I can't lie. I've been on the other end of that conversation where I'm like steamrolling and excited and just going. And so stop me by agreeing with me and being like, yes, 100%. Now let me kind of share my perspective and I will be very open to your perspective. So it works. It works.
And I think that's actually a really good point for everyone to keep in mind too, is sometimes these people don't even know they're doing it, right? Like Patricia, you obviously have more self-awareness than others, and that's why you're in coaching, but I'm sure if we gave people the benefit of the doubt, maybe they don't necessarily know that they're running on. Like I remember a coworker very early in my career, I think it was the first company I ever worked with. She was known for not ever being able to stop talking. Like she'd come over and people would like just disappear on the floor as she got closer because she talked so much and she couldn't stop herself. But the good thing about her was that she wasn't offended when people would just walk away from her. So I think for some people on maybe the extreme end, they don't even know that it's happening or they don't have as much awareness control over pacing the conversation or intentionally making space for other people.
Mhm.
So you interjecting might not be as terrifying or potentially damaging to the relationship as you might think it is, if that's the case.
Oh my goodness, this is really helpful because I think we judge everybody based on how we think we are being perceived. And that's actually not typically the case. And so it's helpful. I used to say more than I needed to, whether it's in emails and conversation. And I say more than I needed to because I'm waiting for the validation. I'm waiting for someone to say, good job, or I agree with you, or I like you, right? So this is one thing you can do this week is pay attention in your emails, pay attention even in your text messages, pay attention in your short conversations, and ask yourself this question. Am I giving out the information that is necessary for this interaction? Or am I saying more in order to get validated or in order to make something happen in the conversation that's not actually needed in that space? And one example is I had someone who was reaching out to someone on LinkedIn, right? They were starting a networking conversation. And the person basically said, yeah, I think she asked her to have a conversation. And the person asked, oh, are you looking for a job? And my client who received this message was like, oh my gosh, they think I'm trying to steal their time and they think I'm lying to them. And so in the message, they wanted to put something along the lines of, well, at first, I messaged because like basically justifying at first I messaged because of XYZ, but actually, yeah, I'm looking for a job and I know that you might have time. And it was just this longer conversation. It was longer than it needed to be. And that's when we kind of, asked a few questions and got around to the idea of, I felt like I was being disingenuous. And then it's the question, were you? Right? And we have to ask that question, were you? And she's like, well, I kind of don't feel like I'm being totally authentic and like I'm pulling the wool over their eyes by reaching out to them. And then after they respond, asking them for the conversation. So then it's like, okay, well, what would an authentic conversation feel like to you? And so we switched a little bit of their funnel, their conversation, the flow of their conversation. Right. And once that feeling on the inside was gone, her conversation was so much more direct, so much more clear. And it just felt like the bottleneck was released.
Yeah. And I think sort of the common theme for what we've been talking about is that in interior dialogue versus what's actually happening in the interactions that we're having with other people. Like it seems to be sometimes that breakdown in communication, whether it's being assertive enough to state what we want to say, or interrupting someone, or having a genuine conversation. It's that concern that we aren't quite hitting the mark, where the other person is probably just asking a question out of curiosity, or they're just being themselves.
Or they genuinely want to be helpful. Like, oh, are you looking for a job? Because I can help.
Yeah, totally. And I think maybe the underpinning takeaway for this is that we don't necessarily need to overthink everything.
Oh, guilty. I overthink. I mean, there's so many things that I overthink, and I have to catch myself. Sometimes you think that because you're a dentist, you have perfect teeth. And it's the same with coaches, where I'm like, oh, there it is. I'm overthinking, and it happens to the best of us. So I'm glad that you pointed that out.
Yeah, no, I'm the same. You should see some of the conversations I have with ChatGPT.
Is it just me?
Exactly.
So,
So, as we kind of start to wrap up on the discussion about like being assertive in conversation and making sure that you're making space for airtime for yourself when maybe others aren't making that space for you, what's one thing you think people can do after they listen to this, they get back into their workday, if they are struggling to find that airtime to voice their opinion or ask questions or even just highlight something that they've done that deserves attention?
yeah. So, two things come to mind. The immediate thought is almost any communication is going to be helpful if it's positive. And so, if you can think of how can I be positively assertive, just right off the top, almost any communication is valid. There's a scripture that says, like, love covers a multitude of sin. So if I'm a good person to you, if I'm positive, if I'm like, hey, I really have this great idea, right? You almost can't go wrong. So that would be the first thing is close it in positivity. And then the second thing that came to mind was, is this going to sound silly and maybe even like a sidebar, but one of the things that I noticed is that when I started to, dress the part, work on my posture, work on my eye contact, like work on these pieces that elevate your presence, almost, I don't want to say inevitably, but it almost like reinforces how you show up. So if you can pay attention to some of the pieces on the outside, similar to when you need confidence, you kind of raise your hands and you take up space, is very similar to that. So that might be one small thing you can do this week to just move your assertiveness forward. What about you?
Yeah. I really love those, Patricia. Thank you. I think for me, it is really looking inward to question those doubts you have of yourself and whether you're actually going to come across in the negative way that you framed yourself. Because that I find that is sometimes the biggest thing that's holding us back from the assertiveness is not necessarily knowing how to, because we all know the general tips and all the things we can do to protect our boundaries and get into the conversation. But when there's that slight hesitation that prevents us from taking what we've learned and putting it into action is there, it's often because we're worried that some catastrophic thing will happen that probably isn't going to happen.
Mm, yeah, I think that's a really good takeaway to just leave this conversation with and say, okay, let me keep that in the back of my head because that is going to influence, basically all our conversations in one way or another.
Mhm.
Wow. This was a great conversation. I feel like we always get into these really good conversations. And if you're listening, I hope that you also walk away with this with just a bunch of gold nuggets to put into practice this week. Know that both Julian and I have our links for you in the description if you're interested in coaching or in just learning more about what we do. And we are so excited for your continued journey along with us to continue to increase our assertiveness while also keeping relationships positive. Any final words, Juliana?
No, I think just go out there and just try it. Try it in a small, less high risk scenario, I'd say, and just see what happens. And honestly, most people's memories are pretty short, unless they are pretty severe people who hold grudges. Most people won't remember what happened if it was a little bit clunky. So give yourself a little bit of a break and take the plunge.
Yeah, give yourself a break and try things out. Let's experiment, see what happens. All right. Thanks so much for listening in today. We'll see you on the next one.
Bye.